In May of 1939, 5 countries sent delegates to London. They gathered inside BBC Broadcasting House for a single purpose: to decide how every instrument on Earth would be tuned. The man who ultimately made the winning argument was not a musician. He was an electrical engineer who had built his career in plastics. His name was Sir James Swinburne, and his reasoning was simple. 439 is a prime number, he argued, making it harder to reproduce electronically. 440, by contrast, divides more cleanly for broadcast equipment. The room agreed. The resolution passed without dissent. 3 months later, the entire world was at war, and that single decision has shaped the sound of every song since. This is not a conspiracy theory about shadowy figures or hidden agendas. This is documented institutional history, preserved in public records. The May 1939 conference was organized by the British Standards Institute. Delegates arrived from France, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and England. Switzerland and the United States participated by mail. The proceedings are part of the public record, and the BSI published the results in December 1939 under the title British Standard Concert Pitch. What is rarely discussed is who was not present in that room. No composers and no professional performers and acousticians working within the vocal or instrumental traditions. The people who made music were not consulted about how music should sound. The people who broadcast music made that decision for them. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what existed before. Before 1939, there was no universal tuning standard. Orchestras in Italy tuned differently from orchestras in Germany. A violin built in Paris and a violin built in Vienna might play the same written note at slightly different frequencies. To modern ears, this might sound chaotic, but it was also organic. Local traditions shaped local sound. Instruments were built for the frequencies their makers preferred, and across centuries and continents, many of those makers kept arriving near the same number, 432. Not all of them, not precisely. Historical pitch varied widely. In different eras and regions, it could range from roughly 380 to 480 hertz. That needs to be stated honestly. No single frequency was universally adopted in the ancient world. But something curious kept happening. Across cultures with no contact with one another, a particular mathematical tradition kept appearing, independently, repeatedly. In 1713, a French physicist named Joseph Sauvé proposed something elegant. He suggested setting middle C to 256 hertz. That number is 2 to the 8th power. When you build a musical scale from that foundation, every octave of C becomes a whole number. C1 becomes 32, C2 becomes 64, C3 becomes 128. Middle C becomes 256, C5 becomes 512. The entire system locks into binary mathematical order. When A is tuned to 432 within this framework, those relationships hold. At 440, they collapse. C becomes an irrational decimal. The binary architecture disappears. Sauvé was not a musician. He was a physicist. He was not arguing for beauty or taste. He was arguing for mathematical coherence. And for more than 2 centuries, his framework was widely recognized as scientific pitch. Then came the wars over sound, not metaphorical wars. Institutional battles fought inside government chambers and international conferences. By the early 19th century, orchestras across Europe had begun competing with each other for brighter, more brilliant tone. The method was simple: tune higher, tighten the strings, push the pitch upward. For audiences, the effect was thrilling. For singers, it was devastating. Their vocal cords were being stretched beyond their design limits. Careers shortened. Voices cracked and failed. Tenors lost their upper register decades earlier than expected. Sopranos developed nodes and hemorrhages. The higher orchestras tuned, the more singers suffered. By the middle of the century, the singers pushed back. They organized. They petitioned. They refused to perform. On February 16, 1859, the French government did something unprecedented. It passed a law about sound, a law that set A above middle C to 435 hertz. This became known as the diapason normal. It was the first government-mandated pitch standard in recorded history. The composers advising the commission included Rossini, Meyerbeer, and Aubert. The standard spread across much of Europe. For a brief moment, the musical world shared a reference point chosen by musicians, for musicians to protect musicians. Then came Verdi. Giuseppe Verdi is not a minor figure in this story. He was the most celebrated composer of his generation, the most performed opera composer in the world. His works filled theaters from Milan to New York. Heads of state attended his premieres. When Verdi spoke about music, governments listened. In 1884, he wrote a letter to the Italian government's music commission. In that letter, he asked for the pitch to be lowered further. His request was precise: A at 432 hertz. His language was equally precise. He referred to what he called mathematical exigencies. Not beauty, not taste, not preference, mathematics. He was making the same argument Joseph Sauver had made in 1713, that certain frequencies align with mathematical structures that others do not, that this alignment is not arbitrary, and that it matters. The Italian War Ministry agreed. They issued a formal decree establishing 432 hertz throughout Italy, an official government standard supported by the most famous living composer on earth. Think about that. A law about sound, passed because the greatest musician alive asked for it, grounded in mathematical reasoning that stretched back 2 centuries. It lasted 1 year. In 1885, a conference in Vienna, dominated by British delegates, rejected Italy's standard. Italian composers were given no meaningful platform. The decree was abandoned. Verdi's frequency had been backed by government law. It had been supported by 2 centuries of mathematical research. It had the explicit endorsement of 23,000 French musicians who signed a petition organized by Professor Dussault of the Paris Conservatory. And it was overruled. The people who understood sound lost. The people who managed standards won. With that defeat, the last institutional effort to anchor music to the mathematical framework that Sauver and Verdi had identified as natural disappeared. The frequency that made the mathematics whole was replaced by a frequency that would eventually prove easier to broadcast, though broadcasting itself would not arrive for decades. The decision anticipated technology that did not yet exist. Now, a fair objection. Reasonable people will point out that pitch has always varied. There has never been a single natural tuning shared universally across all cultures. That is true. Historical pitch ranged widely. Some church organs in Germany were tuned above 500 hertz. Some Baroque ensembles played below 400. The idea that 432 hertz is some cosmic frequency embedded in the universe is, frankly, overstated. And 440 has real, practical benefits. It is easy to generate electronically. It divides cleanly. It simplifies calibration. These were not trivial considerations in a world that was rapidly building standardized broadcast systems. That reality should not be dismissed. But there's a difference between acknowledging that standardization was useful and accepting that the specific frequency chosen was irrelevant. There's a difference between recognizing the need for technical efficiency and assuming that the process by which the decision was made does not matter, especially when the people excluded from that decision were the very people whose lives revolved around sound. Because there is something the body registers even when institutions do not. In 2019, researchers Kalamasi and Pomponi published a double-blind crossover pilot study in the journal Explore. 33 volunteers listened to the same musical pieces on different days. On one day, the music was tuned to 440 hertz. On another day, the exact same recordings were tuned to 432. The listeners did not know which version they were hearing. That detail matters. Neither the subjects nor the researchers administering the listening sessions knew which frequency was playing at any given time. The design was deliberately controlled, and the results were specific. Heart rate dropped by nearly 5 beats per minute during exposure to music tuned to 432 hertz. Blood pressure showed a downward trend. Respiratory rate decreased. Participants reported greater focus and higher satisfaction during the 432 sessions. 5 beats per minute. That is not subtle. that is a measurable shift in autonomic nervous system response produced by a difference of just 8 Hz. In 2022, another study examined the question from a different angle. Researchers measured brain activity directly using EEG across 74 participants. During exposure to music tuned to 432 Hz, listeners showed stronger alpha wave activity in the left prefrontal cortex. Alpha waves are associated with relaxed awareness and emotional acceptance. The researchers were careful in their conclusions. The differences were modest, they noted, but they were measurable, reproducible, documented in peer-reviewed literature, and largely ignored by the institutions that established the global tuning standard. Consider the scale of exposure. Every song recorded since the mid-20th century, every film score, every advertising jingle, every church hymn played through a speaker system, every piece of hold music, every ringtone, every national anthem broadcast on television, every lullaby streamed to a sleeping infant, all of it tuned to 440. From birth to death, modern life has been saturated with frequency chosen primarily for broadcast convenience. It was not selected because of how it affects the human body. It was selected because of how efficiently it could be reproduced by equipment. A frequency whose measurable physiological effects include slightly elevated heart rate and slightly increased autonomic agitation compared to the alternative. The differences are small in any single listening session, but the sessions never stop. The exposure is continuous. It begins before language develops and continues until the final years of life. I sat with this research for weeks before writing about it, not because the evidence is unclear. The evidence itself is straightforward. Dates, names, institutional records, peer-reviewed studies. The difficulty lies in the surrounding narrative. The difficulty is that the conspiracy crowd has poisoned the well so thoroughly that asking legitimate questions about the subject immediately marks you as unserious. Some claim the Nazis weaponized 440 Hz. Others insist Joseph Goebbels personally orchestrated the 1939 conference. There are stories about the Rockefeller Foundation secretly altering musical frequency to control populations. None of that is supported by credible documentation. 440 Hz was proposed as early as 1834 by Johann Schaebler at the Stuttgart Conference. The American music industry had already begun adopting it informally by the 1920s. Goebbels did not invent it. The frequency existed long before the Second World War. But the presence of exaggerated conspiracy narratives has made the real story easier to dismiss. And the real story is troubling enough on its own. You do not need shadowy figures to explain what happened. You need only recognize that engineers made a decision that traditionally belonged to musicians. Mathematical elegance was set aside for broadcast convenience. The human body's response to sound was never part of the calculation. Even the instruments themselves quietly carry traces of the earlier world. Consider a Stradivarius violin, built in Cremona in the early 18th century, carved entirely by hand. Every curve, every thickness of wood, every dimension of its resonant chamber shaped for a musical environment that tuned below 440. Baroque pitch typically sat around 415 Hz. The French physicist Félix Savart, working alongside the celebrated instrument maker Jean-Baptiste Violin, measured the resonant frequency of Stradivarius soundboards at 512 Hz. In Pythagorean tuning, that corresponds to AC built for A at 432. When modern orchestras tune these instruments to 440, they are pushing wood, varnish, and resonant architecture beyond parameters for which they were originally designed. Luthiers have noted this quietly for decades. Some have said so in trade publications. The wood resists. The chambers were carved for a different mathematical relationship. The instrument remembers what the industry decided forget. And that word, decided, is the one that matters. This was not inevitable. It was not the natural culmination of centuries of musical refinement. It was not the unavoidable evolution of practice. It was a decision made in a room, by people with specific priorities, at a specific moment in history, a decision that excluded the people most qualified to make it, a decision that overrode 2 centuries of mathematical research and the explicit advocacy of the most famous composer of the 19th century, once made, The decision hardened into institutional policy. International standards bodies ratified 440 Hz in 1953 and again in 1975. Each time, without meaningful input from performing musicians, the sound was locked in, globally, permanently, and no one has unlocked it since. What does music sound like at the frequency the old instruments were built for? What happens in the body when middle C sits exactly at 256 Hz, a perfect power 2? Instead of the irrational decimal, it becomes at 440. Why did the international community adopt a standard without consulting a single composer? Why was Verdi overruled? Why were the musicians who objected simply ignored, their petitions archived, their concerns dismissed as sentimental? Every lullaby your mother hummed along to, every anthem played at a ceremony you attended, every piece of music that moved you to tears or made your pulse quicken, all of it tuned to a frequency chosen by an engineer who built plastics because it was convenient for radio equipment, not because it was right for the human ear, not because it was right for the human heart, not because anyone asked what sound does to a living body. Your ears have never heard the version of music the instruments were originally built for. Neither have mine. Neither has anyone born after the middle of the 20th century. We inherited a sound we did not choose, from a room we were never invited into, and we have been told that it does not matter, but the body keeps score. The heart rate data suggests otherwise. The brain waves suggest otherwise. The wood of a 300-year-old violin, still straining against its modern tuning, suggests otherwise. And the letter Verdi wrote in 1884, written with the careful frustration of a man who understood exactly what was being lost, suggests otherwise. Somewhere within the mathematical structure that Silver mapped and Verdi defended, there may exist a version of music we have never truly heard, a frequency the instruments remember, a resonance the body recognizes, a sound that was measured, documented, defended by the most celebrated composer of the century, and even encoded in government decree, then quietly replaced by a room full of engineers who decided that broadcast convenience mattered more than what music does to a living human being. The standard still holds. No institution has seriously revisited it. No sustained effort has been made to ask whether the original decision was correct. Attempts to question are often dismissed as pseudoscience. Despite the peer-reviewed data that continues to emerge, the frequency remains fixed. But the question remains as well. If the difference truly does not matter, why was it considered so important to standardize it globally? Why enforce it permanently? And why ensure that the people who actually made music never had a voice in the decision?